And while we wait for people to join, I'd like to promote two things that the GFTU is running. The first is the survey for all workers in Britain and Ireland. Um, we've launched this survey sort of mid-January to kind of know workers' experiences on trade unions and union education and your interest in political economy. It's open to all workers, regardless of nationality or if you're a member of a trade union or not, or if you're currently employed or like if you're out of work at the moment, it doesn't really matter. So please take part. I'll put the link into the chat. And secondly, we have the GFTU Educational Trust's Friends annual meetup next Tuesday at SOAS. It's in London, so if you're around early next week, consider joining us in the evening. It's at 5 p.m. I will talk a little bit about the political economy and why it's very important for trade unions. It's open to everyone. It's not limited to friends of GFTU. So if you're just interested in what the GFTU is doing, you can just come over and hang with us. I'll also put the link into the chat. Okay, give me 2 seconds. Oh, is there an echo? Is it okay? Maybe I'll turn off my. Is it any better now? Okay. I mean, thankfully, I won't be speaking much, so I hope the other speakers' mic is fine. Okay, send chat to everyone. Right, so here are the links, and as usual, we gather questions throughout the session. You don't have to wait until the second half. Please use the Q&A box in the bottom rather than the general chat so that we can keep track. I don't think I have any more announcement. And last thing I will do is to introduce today's chair, Srishti, and then I'll hand over the floor to her. So Srishti Yadav is assistant professor of economics at Azim Premji University in India. I hope I pronounced it right, where she teaches political economy and history of economic thoughts. Srishti holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, New York, and an MA in economics from Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, New Delhi. Her research interests are political economy, agrarian change, economic development, economics of caste, and gender. And she kindly agreed to chair at it's late night over there where she is, so I'm extra grateful for today's chair, and I'll go to the background and hand it over to you, Srishti. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And honestly, I'm just thrilled to be here and be part of this series in advanced political economy. And especially on a session that's on something as important as social reproduction and its the precarious and unpaid labor that comes with it. So I'll begin with a sort of brief introduction about the topic, and then I'll move on to introduce the first speaker. Social reproduction is, in Cindy Cat's words, nothing but the fleshy, messy stuff of life. It is what all of us need to do in order to live. I like to think of it as the work of living. So the work that happens in a factory or in an office is only one type of work. And in fact, there's a lot of work that goes behind making someone ready to go into an office or factory and work for 8 hours a day. And that's exactly what social reproduction is all about. Workers have to first be birthed, like biological reproduction. Then they have to be cared for as children. They have to be socialized into the ways of this world. They have to be educated. Work goes into making them into healthy adults. Then when they enter into, office or factory, this to show up to work every single day, you need to be rested. You need to be fed, you need to have a clean and habitable home, you need to have clean clothes, um, you need to have an emotional existence. All of this takes work. Once you are retired and out of the workforce per se, there's still a lot of work that goes into caring for people who are older. All of this is essential to our lives, um, as essential as the work that happens inside the factory or in the office. The difference is that this work of social reproduction that goes into making the worker is often not recognized as work or is not valued as work in the same way that our employment is, or even when it is sort of paid, it tends to not be paid quite as much. So there is a lot that is going on into making this work possible, and also in a way that the people who are benefiting from it aren't really having to pay all that much for it. And today's session will hopefully shed light on how that happens, what are the contemporary kind of ways in which social reproduction processes are taking place, what have been the sort of big changes in this in the last sort of few decades, what are the challenges today essentially, and maybe a little bit of discussion on how do we think about making this more fair. With that, I will introduce the first speaker for today, Anamary Maqueira Linares. Anamary is Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Manitoba. She's a feminist political economist working within the social reproduction umbrella in the Global South context, particularly the Latin American region and Cuba. She received her PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in 2024. She also received an MSc from the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Ecuador in development economics. And she has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Havana, where she also worked as a young instructor for 5 years before proceeding to her MSc. With that, Anamary, the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Srishti, for the introduction. It's okay. Can you hear me well? Yeah. So, thanks to the organizers. So it's a great pleasure to be here and to share with you some thoughts on this topic. I think in a way sort of Srishti's introductions saved me from going a little bit on some of the thoughts, initial ideas on what is social reproduction. And I just only will add something to this first part, which is that within the academic areas, in the scholarship, social reproduction is also a framework within feminist political economy, which is not homogeneous, it's not monolithic, it's a plural framework through which we try to understand capitalism from a feminist lens. But I argue that it's also useful to analyze non-capitalist experience, to put it like a pretty general. So it is also a methodological approach that has multiple meanings, debates, narratives, very interdisciplinary in nature, and it is rooted in Marxist feminism. My goal today is not to provide an overview of social reproduction approaches. For this purpose, we can so people can go to previous editions of this series, in which great scholars have talked more about that. But to discuss some aspects that are relevant to analyze Global South context and more generally and the QR context in particular. So what do we mean by social reproduction? There are also a lot of definitions, so Srishti shared one of them with you. But overall, social reproduction refers to all the activities and the labor, of course, that go with them, paid and unpaid, that are necessary to maintain and produce life daily, both at the level of the individual and also at a social scale. So some approaches, for example, social reproduction theory, go more specific to think about all these socioeconomic processes that make it possible for the working class to reproduce their capacity to work, also daily and intergenerationally. And these processes are very much marked by gender, race, and different, what it's called categories of oppression that are constantly shaping and related to the ways in which workers' surplus is extracted. within capitalist economies. So one of the areas, excuse me, of interest as well for social reproduction feminisms is precisely the dynamics in this production, social reproduction nexus. And I'll be back to this idea in a moment. But I'm not interested only in the social reproduction processes, but also in the institutional sites and conditions under which that reproduction happens. So, which means, in a way, thinking about what is the role and the responsibilities of social institutions, such as the state, the family, the market, and communities regarding social reproduction processes. This has been a very fertile terrain of social reproduction feminisms in which the role of the state, for example, have been conceptualized mainly as a mediator between social reproduction and capital accumulation, in which the specific balance of power between capital and labor and between men and women determine in great extent the wish of state intervention. This idea of the state intervene to either relieve or exacerbate the burden of the cost of social reproduction of the family onto the family. And in this function, the state, of course, regulates or deregulates capital, the labor market, and the provision of social services to make the conditions for capital accumulation stable, to stabilize the conditions under which social reproduction takes place. This is not, of course, the only way in which the state has been conceptualized regarding social reproduction processes in capitalism, but I would say that it's a quite common way of looking at the role of the state. This analysis often implies that social reproduction processes are mostly theorized as a precondition for accumulation strategies, right? So in other words, dynamics of accumulations come first, and then to some extent determine or condition social reproduction. Social reproduction processes are thought as subordinated to capital accumulation. But if we center Global South experiences, so many of Global South approaches will contest that directionality. For example, Sara Estebano argues that in peripheral economies, such as Mozambique, and I'm quoting, social reproduction imperatives are not mitigated by the state, and social reproduction is largely family-centered. Social reproduction comes before and shapes engagement with production. In this case, agricultural production, cash earning activities, or just casual wage labor, unquote. So I will argue something similar for the Cuban case. So this approach of the state as the mediator and the role of the different institutions in the distribution of the cost of social reproduction has been, I would say, quite popular and useful on analyzing, for instance, the neoliberal transformations and structural adjustment programs. Although a lot of work that you find in this has been done for global North countries. So when these processes of transformation, in a way, reshape the role of the state, right? So there are these processes in which the state sort of withdraw from some of the responsibilities that it previously had, or sort of reshape that role. And this has been documented along with an increasing burden on social reproduction to shift to the private domain, say the family, with the gender consequences that it has, and also an increasing commodification and marketization, I would say, of social reproduction. However, this type of analysis sometimes presupposes that a previous welfare state was in place, right? So in a way, there was already a welfare state providing certain, amount of social provisioning. So there is a need of sort of reclaiming first to recover the role of the state in the social reproduction processes, mainly as direct provisioner of welfare. But again, so in many Global South contexts, the welfare state sometimes has never existed, or the state involvement in social reproduction processes has been quite different, as well as processes of commodification are oftentimes limited. This is not, of course, true for all the Global South. The Global South is also heterogeneous, and you have a lot of different experiences in which the state has had a strong presence in different ways. But we have sort of to recognize that if we sort of center this Global South perspective, there are different mechanisms of state involvement that need to be grasped, even when the consequences of the transformations in the Global South oftentimes resemble those of neoliberal transformations in the Global North. So here is where I think that there is a growing body of work that has centered the Global South in their analysis and from which we can learn a lot. For instance, by expanding the analysis, the scope, extending the content of reproductive labor, by understanding that wage labor is not often dominant in our context, either because it is not dominant in the employer-employee relationship, or it is not dominant with respect to the part of the social reproduction that is covered when wages are low or when commodification is not the rule. So it is helpful also by expanding this analysis centering Global South, expanding the understanding of different forms of surplus extraction and accumulation, looking at the links of informal labor, understanding the centrality of land, and in general, sort of rethinking this production, social reproduction nexus in different ways. So within this kind of broad context, Cuba, I think, is an interesting case to look at through this lens, not only because it is part of the Global South, obviously, but because the Cuban experience provides an opportunity to think about also non-capitalist context, whatever this means. And this is always a very contentious point, but I will leave it like that so far, with a strong stake. So even though many of the previous insights I mentioned are very useful to understand Cuba, I believe that a very useful framework to look at the relationship between the state and social reproduction, as well as the distribution of the cost of social reproduction in Cuba, is through the concept of the reproductive bargain, as elaborated by Professor Ruth Pearson from the University of Leeds. So I'll briefly refer to what the reproductive bargain is and why it is important, and then I will broadly outline the key transformations regarding the role of the state, the families, and the market, with an emphasis in the care of dependents that have happened in Cuba after 2010, which is the period of known as Raúl Castro's reforms. So the social reproductive bargain talks about, or refers to, the ways in which goods and services for reproduction in the widest sense have been provided in Cuba, not only in the short run, but also has a way to understand the continuity of the social and the human aspects of reproduction between the state and the people. And indeed, in the political realm, this defines or determines the legitimacy of people's political support to the state and its vision of what the socialist, or at least the official vision of what the socialist project is about or has been about. So a particular reproductive bargain is sustained when the arrangements between the different parts involved, including the care arrangements, guarantee with some degree of transparency the legitimacy of a particular economic, social, and political project. Let's say decent living standards, access to social services, social justice, some degree of participation and workers' control, professional and personal satisfaction without the fear of being excluded or marginalized. All of that could be part of, is part of that reproductive bargain. When this is broken, right, some sort of renegotiation takes place, either implicitly or explicitly. And recognizing that rupture is very important for transparency purposes regarding who is doing what, who is bearing the cost of social reproduction, and also contributes to establish public policy priorities. So if this is not done, so if the rupture of that reproductive bargain is not recognized, this is a very strong source of conflict and contradiction, because the gap between the promises of whatever project we are talking about, in this case, the Cuban project, and the actual material conditions for social reproduction widens. So this is explicit. Framework takes a very explicit form after 2010, but it could be analyzed also for previous periods in the Cuban case, in which an explicit renegotiation of that reproductive bargain has been taking place in Cuba after the reforms and counter reforms that started in 2010, and that have in a way continued or not after in 2018 and 2019. So the key transformations could be summarized as follows. So there have been an increasing commodification of different social reproduction and care processes since 2010 in a context of income deterioration, increasing inequality and poverty. This is in the Cuban case. Families, and particularly women, are taking the lion's share of what was previously socially or publicly provided. And a destatization process has happening has happened, has occurred, has a combination of direct withdrawal of the government's role as social provider in many key areas, but also has a result of less state presence in other socioeconomic affairs. So this means that the role of the Cuban government in social reproduction has changed. Both has the direct social provisioner and has an institution with the power to enable or constrain people's and workers' capacity to meet and manage their needs. So this reconfiguration implies a familiarization of social reproduction with its gender consequences, an increasing reliance on income to acquire goods and services, the wagening of household income, so the loss of the weight of wages in the whole income, especially of the workers who are employed in the state-owned sector, an increasing monetization of socioeconomic affairs in a context of high inflation and scarcity. So there is a gradual increase in reliance on income from non-state employment, informal employment, and remittances, which is, of course, aggravated in the current context of the Trump's oil blockade that started at the beginning of this year. So this full, broad picture implies a high precarization of labor and social reproduction processes in Cuba today, in which the social reproduction imperatives come first and condition how people engage in the production, with implications for labor productivity and for the maintenance of the reproductive bargain. In other words, the requirements of reproduction weakening the production of goods and services while accounting for an important part of the dissatisfaction of political mobilization in mass organization and with respect to the whole political system. At the same time, and with this, I'm going to finish these introductory remarks. The social reproduction imperatives are not equally distributed, reflecting, of course, unequal dynamics across gender, race, class, area, residency, age, etc. And this is a result of a lack of comprehensive reforms, a result of the ongoing social reproduction crisis, the result of the current crisis within the crisis, which is aggravated by the escalation of the U.S. hostile policy against Cuba. And it's here for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anamary. That was quite insightful, and there's a lot for us to unpack as we head to the discussion. But before that, I am delighted to introduce the second speaker, Luiza Nassif Pires. Luiza is an assistant professor at the Institute of Economics at UNICAM and the co-director of MADE-USP, the research center on macroeconomics of inequalities. She holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research and is a research associate in the Gender Equality and Economics program at the Levy Economics Institute at Bard College, where she lectured in the grad program in economic theory and policy and public policy. She's also a member of the board of directors of the International Association for Feminist Economics, or IAFE. With that, Luiza, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. You can hear me, right? Thank you so much, Srishti and Anamary. It's an honor to be here in the space, and with people that I don't know, I have a longer relationship than in this space. Srishti was my colleague at the New School, and Anamary was a colleague at UMass. So we've been, I guess, discussing these things for quite a few years now, and it's nice to have an opportunity of kind of coming together and like bringing our minds with other minds to discuss things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about care policies in Latin America, but I'm going to also, I guess a lot of the things I'm going to say is just going to go in the same direction of what Anamary said, because I am going to use Brazil a little bit, where I'm based, as to give some context on that, as Brazil being one country in Latin America that is very, I guess it has some of the characteristics of Latin America that are important to understand how care provision is done here. They're very, very strong in Brazil, such as racism and inequality. So it's a country very marked by those things, and I think that helps a lot us understand how care policies work here. I just need 1 second to get my notes. Okay, So I'm going to start talking a little bit about what I understand as the care crisis, or what I think is a political economy Marxist understanding of care crisis. Then I'm going to talk about how the provision of care in Latin America is right now, and then discuss the possibilities of care policies and how they have developed in our countries and what are the obstacles for that, with a highlight of the case of Brazil. So when we talk about care crisis, more and more, the term became very popular, I would say, and also the way that people talk about care crisis this day, the way I see it is that as they are taking a symptom of the care crisis as the care crisis, which is the aging population and the fact that we are not able anymore to provide for that aging population, given that we have less people capable to do so. And for me, this is actually just a symptom of what I understand what the crisis is, and crisis here really in a very Marxist sense. So as Srishti and Anamary pointed on the social reproduction theory, you can think of this as there is a capitalist incentive to exploit as much as they can and expropriate as much as they can from the workers. And that comes together with expropriating this unpaid labor. And this leads to this inability of the care workers to reproduce themselves properly as they're being more and more exploited. So longer hours, lower wages, and so on. And this makes so that it's harder for our population to be reproducing itself properly or in decent ways. And this is what I understand as a care crisis, and this is what leads to this symptom of it, which is this aging population. And also we can think of this care crisis as being integrated with other crises and in a way reinforcing them. So if you think of the climate crisis, for example, which is also something that we can understand as like seated in the way that capitalism works, and how it integrates with the care crisis, with the climate changes making it even harder for people to reproduce themselves, and at the same time the care crisis also meaning that people can care less for the environment and so on. So there's also a link between those two things that is helpful when we think of care crisis in this very Marxist sense, I would say. So that said, care is essential for life, and at the same time we have the system that is deploying our capacity to care. But care is provided because otherwise we wouldn't be here. The way I see it is that care is provided in general through some kind of social pact. So you need a certain way of deciding how our society, it's a social problem. So we don't care as individuals only. This is something that is organized socially. And as such, you could have an explicit social pact. So for example, a welfare state that is providing care for a community. Or you can have implicit social pacts, which means that we have somehow solved this care crisis through whatever our system has provided us. And I would say that in the case of Brazil, this is falling under two things, which is sexism. And this I would say happens in all of the world in some way. So through the unpaid care work, for example, so we have all of this, I would say tacit institutions like patriarchy that is helping us continue caring for people. And the other is racism, which is, I think, very, very strong in Latin America and Brazil in particular. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So as soon as you don't have an explicit agreed upon social pact to provide care, you end up with this, I don't know, solutions that are definitely not ideal and not going hand in hand with social justice. So in Latin America, the provision of care is in general falling under family. And within family, we're going to have different ways of organizing that. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. So there are some characteristics of Latin America that are important to understand the care crisis here and how it's being solved. Or when I say solved, is how it's being dealt with, let's say, more than actually solved. So the characteristics of Latin America that I think are important for us here. The first is obviously inequality. And inequality is going to mean a lot. So I'm going to talk about four things here in Latin America, and I'm going to try to unpack how that leads to specific aspects of the care provision in Latin America. So inequality, the first, means that we have a bigger need for social protection system, and we have a bigger need for whatever the services that the government is providing. So when you are in an extremely unequal country, and if you're not gonna have, so the case of Brazil, for example, Brazil is a very unequal country that doesn't have as much a problem with poverty as other countries that are less unequal. And this has to do with the welfare state that we have built. But this welfare state in Brazil has been based on the provision of public health and public education, but not public care. So there is a difference there on how that has been done. But given that inequality, I would say it's even more important so that we have the public provision of care being done. The second aspect of inequality has to do with our difficulty of actually, and this is going to connect to the macro, to some macro aspects as well, but it has to do with the fact that that we have a limited fiscal space as far as it goes in terms of gathering taxes. So tax revenues in very unequal countries, they're going to work a little differently than in equal countries or more equal countries or more advanced countries, because you don't have a large part of your population that are going to be paying progressive taxes. You're going to have a huge reliance as well on indirect taxations, which are very unjust in other ways. But I'm just going to mention that very quickly because that connects to the macroeconomic aspects. The second characteristic of inequality is the informality in the labor market. And this is also going to mean that there is not really as much access to social protection systems. So a lot of the policies that are not thought of care policies, so say, for example, maternity leave, those are only provided to formal workers. So you also have a inequality in access to specific policies that should be universal and that are understood from a feminist perspective as a care policy. The third characteristic, as I already mentioned as well, is the very long history of slavery. Brazil was the last country in the continent to end slavery. And this really marks the provision of, even so more the provision of paid care work, obviously unpaid care work as well, but it does leave an extremely important mark in the case of Brazil. We cannot talk about the provision of care work in Brazil without really discussing structural racism. And the last characteristic of Latin America that I think matters here are more macroeconomic aspects, and this is going to have an impact on our ability to provide those policies and how and this has to do a lot with what Anamary was saying and the recent changes. But the external dependency, the inflation, the external indebtedness, which leads to a very strong popularity of austerity policies and the cutting of the state. So we have at the same time a bigger need for the provision of a public good that has not been seen so far as something that is part of that pack of things that we think of in terms of welfare state. So it's not health, it's not education, it's something else that becomes more popular recently, and we're trying to get that going at the same time that we have austerity policies and cuts and expenditure cuts. One expression of this is what happened in Brazil. So Brazil approved its care policy, which makes it institutionalized, the fact that every Brazilian has the right to care, to be cared for, and to self-care. So this happened 2 days before there was an approval of an expenditure cut on social expenditure in Brazil. So those things are really walking hand in hand, and it's very conflicting and contradictory. And I'm gonna at the end mention this a little bit more. So given all of those characteristics, what does this mean? So when we think of the provision of care, we use a lot this tool, which is called the care diamond. So the care diamond is just this, I would say, graphic tool to visualize how care is provided. And you can think of it as a diamond, and you have all of the entities that can provide care, which is the family, the market, the community, and the state. And what you can think of in Latin America is that, well, care in general is going to fall under the responsibility, the organization of the family. But then you're going to have a split, which is within those that are the rich families. What you're going to have is that they are then buying services at the market. So either hiring a domestic worker or buying substitute goods in the market. So they're going to be just using the market a lot to provide that. While for everyone else, I would say you have a huge reliance either on the state, which is not as much there, but also on the community. So communal care, I would say community kitchens, for example, it's something very common in Latin America. Or I don't know, one thing I was thinking of, I don't know how many of you watched Bad Bunny at the Super Bowl, but there's that one that scene that was very commented, and that really is something that is very Latin America, which is that kid sleeping on the chair during the wedding, that he goes and wakes up that kid. So this idea of the, I don't know, the space where the children are in the community and we are doing everything together. And there's something very beautiful about that as well. But like it brings about a lot of memories as growing up in Latin America, having gone to work with my parents a lot and being in those spaces that are not necessarily in the global north, spaces where we would have children being at and participating as much. And this has to do as well with this idea of community care. So a care policy would come to, in some way, release this reliance on the family, take part of this responsibility from the family, and then put that on the state. And as I mentioned, I already mentioned like healthcare and education, and those are as well, in a way, care. It's provision of care when you're educating a young child or when you're providing health services to people. Those are care services. But care policies are thought of very differently because they're thought in an integrated way, in the sense that when you make a care policy, you don't instrumentalize the care provider. So for example, it's very different if you're thinking of care for children as a care policy. You would also need to think of how, for example, the main responsible person for the children in the household is going to be able to drop off that kid on the school, or is gonna how long that school is gonna go for. So like integral time school, for example, is something that is very important if you're thinking of the ability of women to participate in the labor market, and you're not just thinking of bringing about a child that then is educated and so on. So there is a very different logic to what is a care policy. So education can be a care policy, but it needs to be thought in a more integrated way with other areas. And in general, effective care policies, they're also going to be integrated with social protection policies. They are going to be thought as macroeconomic policies as well. And I am also going to mention a little bit that. I don't have that much time, so I'm going to try to go quickly. So we did a little bit. So I recently did a work with a student of mine, and we were mapping the provision of care in Latin America by the state. And we did this map. And basically what we see is that we can think of care policies as in different like levels of development. So some countries are not going to have any policy whatsoever. Some are going to have some policies that are not really thought of in this integrated way. And then you have a set of countries which are trying to provide care policies, as is the case of Brazil, but without thinking of it as a system, as a care system, and other countries which are trying to go towards implementing a care system. And by doing this mapping, it was interesting for us to look into some specific cases because they bring about some insights on how to be successful in that. So the most successful case in Latin America, I would say, is Uruguay, who has a very well implemented care system. It's for me, Uruguay is almost like an utopia. If there are Uruguayans there, they might disagree with me, of course, looking from outside. But it's a very small country as well, with low inequality. It's a little easier to think of the implementation of that, although it was not easy at all. But anyways, it's still like it's not directly applicable to the Brazilian case, for example. But anyways, one thing for me about the Uruguayan care system that is very important is that it became such a hallmark of policies in Uruguay that it seems that it's there to stay. So there's something also about our continent that we've been thinking a lot about recently, which has to do with the political instability. I mean, this is not just of Latin America, definitely of whole America, but elsewhere as well. But one issue with care policies is, what if we implement a care policy and then comes a next government, which is an extreme right government, and just cuts all of that off? And this is exactly what happened in Argentina, for example. They were implementing care policies, comes an extreme right policy government, and then everything is gone. And the case of Uruguay shows the importance of making those policies something that the population will fight for, that the population is relying on. So when this becomes something so important for the population, it doesn't matter which kind of government comes, because care is something that is important for everyone. And it's much harder to dismantle. And this is something that I also think it's important to, in a different case of Brazil compared to Argentina as well. Argentina never passed a law. Brazil has passed a law before even start implementing policies. The case of Colombia is also very, very interesting. They are walking towards having a care system. Cuba also is implementing a care system. They also passed a lot to implement a care system. Maybe Anamary can say more about that. But anyways, but the case of Colombia for me is interesting as well, because the way they're doing is really building on the territory. So Bogota specifically has done a lot of interesting things. So when you have a continental country, like is the case of Brazil, we're very unequal countries, which have different like areas and regions, it's important as well on how you build those policies from the ground and then expand it to become something that is national. Okay, so just, oh my God, how much more I have. I'm gonna also talk a little bit about some macroeconomic aspects, and I think this might be where I'm gonna end at, and we can talk more later. But one difficulty that we have, as I mentioned, is austerity, this lack of fiscal space. And the case of Brazil is also interesting because we approved the policy in 2024, and then we presented or launched a care plan in December last year. And the care plan, there's some particularities of this. The first one, for anyone that think in public policy senses, this is a very intersectorial policy. So we have, 21 ministries involved in that policy in the case of Brazil, for example. So some of the budget's going to come from health, some of the budget from education, some of the budget are coming from municipalities, some from states. It's a little bit of a mess, which means that the plan was launched and it has a ridiculous budget of its own. The budget is basically depending on other people joining that plan and then making those policies that they already have, say, for example, a health policy, something that is also thought of as a care policy. Or if you are in education, expanding the hours of education, for example. But this is something for the education ministry to then think about and then say that this is a care policy. So the care plan is much more a plan of one secretariat within one ministry to coordinate among 21 ministries to try to kind of make that look like care and guarantee that provision of care. It's very difficult. And part of why this is difficult has to do exactly with the fact that it doesn't have a budget. So care is not seen as a macroeconomic, it's not seen as, well, not as a macroeconomic policy, but it's not seen as a policy that is good for the macroeconomy and for the health of the macroeconomy. And one of the things that feminist economists have been pointing to is that care is an investment. So when you think of investing on the future population and it could even go on a very neoclassical term and thinking of human capabilities as well. That's not as neoclassical way of putting it, but you have high multiplier effects. So care sectors have high multiplier labor effects and GDP effects. They are very effective in anti-inequalities. They create jobs mostly for women at the same time that they are allowing women to participate in the labor force. So you can defend, what I'm trying to say is you can defend care as investment not only from a more heterodox perspective, but even from a very orthodox perspective that's easy to defend. And still, it's not in the pack of the kind of policies that governments are thinking of when they're developing whatever is their development plan for the next 5 years or whatever. It's not thought of. It's not something that the finance ministries are talking about. It's something that is always allocated in the social development ministry, and it's seen as a social policy, as social expenditure, and not as investment. And this has a very huge political impact, I would say. In the case of Brazil, for example, as the way that austerity works in Brazil right now is that we have a fiscal rule. That fiscal rule like really writes down how much you can spend on investment, how much you can spend on other things. So there is a incentive when you are in debt in those countries to cut social expenditure and boost investment. But care is not seen as investment. So this also takes a toll on increasing investment. So I think I'm gonna stop by just making this summary of some of what I see are the obstacles to the advancement of care policies in Latin America. The first is the political instability, which I just mentioned en passant, but I think it's very important for us to know because part of this difficulty has to do with a lack of visibility of care policies and this framing of care policies as social policies, which is, I mean, it's a gender policy, right? And we know that extreme right governments are not going to be that sympathetic to gender policies, although there has been some, I don't know, there is sometimes the extreme right politicians are more open to discuss those things from a more kind of family, traditional family kind of framing, which is also dangerous. So there is also a danger of the way that care policies could be led in the future if it ends up being something that the extreme right is the one leading forward and not, progressive governments that are thinking in the decrease of inequalities, for example. But the main obstacle that I want to point to here, I guess as an economist, is this lack of fiscal space and the framing of how this lack of fiscal space is done in Latin America. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luiza. We can now get into a discussion. What I appreciated about both of your remarks is that you start with your context. I mean, you are placing your arguments in your context in the sense that you are centering the global south in how you even begin to think about social reproduction. I think that this is incredibly useful for our audience as well, because a lot of the things that you have spoken about the global south context are in fact now increasingly applying to the global north as well. Whether we are talking about destatization or the withdrawal of the state, or perhaps, I mean, because I'm using the withdrawal language, even though Anamary, you make a very good case against why that is not necessarily sort of the reality of the global south. There wasn't a welfare state to start with that could then be withdrawn. But the Cuba example that you showed us, that you talked to us about, sort of does indicate how what it means for the bargain to change. So within that care diamond of the four main sort of players who can make care happen, you have the family, you have the market, you have the community, and you have the state. And it's always some combination of these. And the Cuba, example that you gave us showed how that combination changed. And we see that that has also sort of been the reality in the global north in many ways, manifesting perhaps in different ways, and of course in a very different context. Luiza, when you speak about informality and inequality, so that the breadwinner model in which there could be one worker who is earning for the entire family, and then there is someone at home who is doing all of the care work, all of the social reproduction. That model, which we could have sort of seen in the global north for some decades in the 20th century, is also sort of completely in decline. That's not the world anymore. So I think a lot of the challenges and the specificities of the global south context are in fact very much translatable to the global north as well. But so let me pose some questions to you specifically. I thought that it would be good to talk about, so for example, Anamary, if when we discuss the Cuba context and the changing configuration of care and social reproduction, could you maybe talk a little bit about, so in my mind, at least for the three ends of the care diamond, family, community, and market, there are good things and bad things about each of them. It's not as if any of them is superior to the other. So this is something that both of you mentioned sort of briefly, but I wonder if we could talk about why commodification might not be an escape from, or a progress towards some like a better way of organizing care than whatever precedes commodification. Particularly in the global south, because as Anamary, you laid out, social reproduction and production are very much intertwined together, and social reproduction so much more mediated by family, community. Could you talk us through how a move from family, community to commodity or market is rife with, all kinds of contradictions?
Okay, should I start then? Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Luiza. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting points that maybe I would touch upon. The first one with respect to the care crisis, the symptom that Luiza was mentioning, I sort of totally agree with that. Maybe after going to respond a little bit to Srishti's question, I can refer briefly to that, and also to the national system of care that was approved in Cuba in 2024, and how this is highly paradoxically. So there have been a lot of progress in Cuba at the level of the recognition in terms of changes in the regulatory framework that sort of contrast at the same time with the current crisis of social reproduction that the country is going through, and the crisis of care that the country is going through. So it's sort of paradoxically, but at the same time, so it's kind of a response, I would say, to that crisis, and kind of the possibility that some groups within Cuba it was not a state, that this is important, is something that I wanted to mention, that there was not a government-led project. This was a project that was led by networks in Cuba within official institutions, of course, the university, the national Cuban national network of care. So I'm kind of translating exactly. That sort of with university professors and a lot of other organizations that push a lot through government institutions to incorporate an unpaid labor project within the Ministry of Labor, that took a lot to convince the Ministry of Labor that an unpaid project was part of their job. So to start with, because in their very own conceptions of what an unpaid labor project has to do with us, right? So it took a lot of effort to these national organizations to really made their way through the the government institutions, to really start to push and to incorporate the recognition part of paid labor. I'll go back to that in a moment. So I think that the question, so it's sort of what's the ideal configuration, more or less, of or how we have been talking about a change in let's say the diamonds, that there are parallels between the concept of the care diamond and the cost of social reproduction. So the framework that I'm using. So more of the claim that I'm making is less of thinking about the ideal configuration, but first recognizing that the configuration has changed. So recognizing that the roles of what existed before, that was a system that was more like, in which the social reproduction, or many of those processes were provided via the state, and that specific arrangement was in place, changed. And not recognizing that change is what I think it is problematic, right? So we have to start by, okay, so we recognize that this has changed. So, and why? Well, because this has implications for, the priorities that we can establish in terms of public policies, but also for, the implementation of the reforms, for the very own discourse that the government, has in front of the people, for the legitimacy of the project, for transparency purposes, right? So, and you were mentioning something that was important. So what you observed in Cuba was just an increase in the familiarization processes, an increase in many of the commodification of care processes, right? So is this a good or a bad thing? Right? So this is a good question as well. I think that in the Cuban context, there are different challenges to this commodification. So there are, I think that, so one positive thing I would say is, okay, we can take the example of childcare, right? So the public childcare and public facilities historically in Cuba never went above 25% of covering the demand, right? So you can say that, on average, historically, the 75% of children under 5 have been taken care by their own families, or by other arrangements that are not through, public centers. So that's kind of one data that we know. So what happened then? So if from the starting point in which the private management of childcare is allowed, right? So there is an increasing in the availability of private places and private spots for children under 5 to be taken care of, and so which is good. So you have certain families that can now pay for those services, which is also quite, so there is a variety of different prices depending on the quality of the places and all of that. But of course, so we have, let's say the negative side of this is that, of course, not everybody can pay for that. Not all families can afford that increasing commodification of this particular, care service, let's say childcare. And still a lot of children under 5 are still taken care by their mothers or their grandparents, in the Cuban case, especially, right? So then if increasing commodification goes, I would say, in parallel with also increasing in the, the real wage or the real income on the wage you can afford, or goes hand by hand with and specific coherent design policies in which you can think maybe in public-private alliances or some sort of configuration. Well, it's not necessarily, a bad thing per se. When I think it is problematic is when, so that's the solution, to the care crisis. That's when that's the solution, then, things could be problematic because you have, not a universal policy. You don't have a full coverage. You have not thought about or different alternatives. And similarly happened with, elder care. So there have been an Q1 case, which is also an aging population. With the last years, there have been a very high migration. So estimate pointed out that around Q1 has lost since 2020 around 13% of its population. This is a huge number. So 8 out of 10 people who migrate are of working age, and 57% of them are women. So we have talked about that in the last 6 years, there have been a huge disruption because of the migration, and the care arrangements have been renegotiated highly. And now we are not actually can think about care arrangements without thinking about the diaspora, without thinking in the transnational dimension of the reproductive bargain. So which is now very important. So I can talk about that later also if we want, because the role of remittances here is very crucial for Cuba, and it's posing like an extra challenge to this reproductive bargain. And it's also playing a very important role in reconfiguring these care arrangements. But maybe I just want to quickly talk a little bit about Luiza's point on the approval of the system, of the national system of care in Cuba, very quickly. So one of the dimensions of why I would say it is important to, talk about this change in the reproductive bargain, or this change in the social arrangement and the care diamond, if we want, because it's more visible, I think, easier to understand. In Cuba, it's precisely illustrated by the role of unpaid labor. So in an exercise that Catherine Moose and I did with some Cuban data for 2016, which is what previous to the current crisis, I will bet that for the current crisis that this will be, different. But for that year, so we thought about, okay, so what are the components of the Cuban cost of social reproduction? What are the key, elements? So household production is one of them. Of course, remunerations from workers, both informal and formal. The government benefits, remittances, those are key components for the reproduction of the Cuban people. Well, in that exercise, so we said we estimate that the component that contributing the most is precisely household production. So through imputing a value to all the unpaid labor that has been done in Cuba for that year, unfortunately, it's the only year that we come with information with time use data for the Cuban case. Around 31% of the total cost of social reproduction was covered by household production. So this, of course, the numbers have limitations and all of that, but the second component was actually remittances with around 27%. So you have that the work, unpaid labor of domestic people and the paid labor of Cubans in the diaspora are covering around 58% of the cost of Cuba, as estimated, the cost of Cuba reproduction for 2016. Again, so right now, in the middle of the current crisis, so these numbers will be, I'm sure, that totally different. But we already are seeing, a case in which the importance of unpaid labor that has not been recognized, or that was not recognized until very recently, is very significant in the Cuban case. And part of why, so there was a recognition of, yes, there was a gender division of labor in Cuba, despite the gains of women with respect to participation in employment, education, reproductive rights, etc. But there was less attention to why that division of labor was prevailing. And one of the reasons that I think is because there has been an insufficient critical interrogation of the role of the state's responsibility in omitting the importance of unpaid labor has contributed to the economy. Right, so this idea that unpaid work can act not only as a subsidy for capital, but also as a subsidy to the state. So you can keep maintaining, low wages and particularly low social provisioning, because in a way, so unpaid labor is going to jump in and is going to, try, or at least try, to make up for whatever is not being provided by the rest of the components. Right? And I think this was very visible after COVID-19, so there was no possibility of keep ignoring this. And this is in part what explains this advancement in the recognition agenda that has been going on in Cuba. I can, talk about more specific examples if we will have time then in the Q&A, but that ended up with, in 2024, the approval of this national system of care, which I think great at the level of, the recognition, which is the first step. So if you don't recognize it, then of course you cannot make policies out of it. But all the current situation plus other issues that are related to the the institutionality and how the law, the regulation, it's designed. It's risk of not having the implementation possible. So lack of resources, lack of a budget. So there is no, any like specific idea of what it's going to be, the implementation is going to look like. And in the Cuban case, it's I think a little more challenging comparing with the Brazilian case, because it's not only about the fact of where do we put the money, which is also about where do we put the money, but it's also a very own lack of resource generation. And I think that's why the Cuban case is even more important. The role of the state not only have directly providing social services and contributing to social reproduction process, but also have enabled the conditions for the economy to start to change. I think I will leave it here.
Thank you so much. Luiza, you're of course welcome to weigh in on this question as well if you'd like to. And any responses to Anamary's comments. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think allows for a considered care policy? Like, what are the ingredients in that? I'm sorry, but you have to tell us, what are the ingredients in a successful care policy? Like, what does it take for a country to be able to implement that? And relatedly, what is the rethinking in progressive politics that can enable this to happen? You can also, of course, bring in any other dimensions. One thing that just struck me was that maybe crisis is one of the things that, like something like the COVID crisis, is something that are things that bring care to visibility a little bit more than usual times and normal times. But what allows some countries to be successful, relatively more successful at this than others?
Okay, I think there too. Thank you so much. I have a million thoughts in my mind. I guess I'm gonna start responding that question by kind of connecting to something that Anamary was saying right at the beginning, which is how care policies started to be thought of in the case of Cuba, and it's also the case of Uruguay, and it's a little bit also the case of Colombia, which is from mobilization of, it's always some network of feminists that have some influence, that start talking about that, and that have some kind of entry in the government that pushes this agenda forward. I'm putting a link on this chat. I don't know if someone can then put also on the YouTube. So this is only for people that can read in Portuguese, but I guess people that can read in Spanish can also understand. So this is a kind of a small graphic novel that we did with people that work on the care system in Uruguay, kind of telling the story of how the Uruguayan care system was implemented, and a little bit in the sense of also like translating in kind of images that positive story of how care can be done. The sense of we're always thinking of this care crisis as something that is like, like women with their hairs going all around and like taking 5 children and working and so on, and like tangling way too many things. But it's also like this utopia of how a caring society could be. And I think Uruguay kind of demonstrates a little bit of that and how it was implemented. So we worked on that, and I'm putting that there. And as Ana Maria was talking, as I was thinking of that, exactly because they start telling the story this way. And this is similar as well. So one thing that struck me between the case of Colombia, talking with people from Colombia and from Uruguay, was the importance of the time use survey. So those stories usually start with, oh, they had a time use survey. People started working with the time use survey and were able to illustrate and make visible that problem in a way that society connects to it. So, I mean, it's anyone can understand what we're talking about when we talk about care crisis if you talk to them. It's very daily. It's something that relates to every woman's, daily life. But at the same time, when you put it in numbers and you make it something that, like you have the whole evidence-based public policy these days, so it kind of creates a certain punch that also helps push the agenda. So I think measuring that and being able to translate that has been important for many countries. Brazil doesn't have a time use survey, so this is one of the things that is being pushed for in the case of Brazil. And our story is a little different in terms of care policies. We come late in the history of the continent on implementing those, honestly, especially given how advanced our welfare system is. We have a universal health system that works very well, that is, but we never thought of a care policy up to now. So I think this is part of it, is how developed your agenda and research agenda on those areas are. I would say a successful care policy, again, it's going to be different depending on the type of country. So I'm going to frame it in terms of Brazil again. The first, and I think these are things that really, when they were implementing the policy itself here, right? Not the plan yet. This was considered. The first is considering the paid labor and labor rights. And this is something that I think is especially important in like countries with high informality rate, with precarious jobs, and so on. So in the case of Brazil, for example, the policy started being discussed in an interministerial group, which like is this, I don't know, institution that meets for 6 months to discuss how the policy is going to go. And there was a representation from the domestic workers trade union in that table. They were there participating of the whole process. So this has been very important. And I think in general, Brazil, I think this is one of the key issues in Brazil. So what we have right now, I didn't have much time to go through that, but one example of this, so 18% of Black women in Brazil, Black and brown women, self-recognize us in our survey, are domestic workers that are in the labor market, sorry, the occupied ones. 18% of them are domestic workers. This is still a huge occupation for them. And their salaries are below minimum wage when we look into the data. The informality rate is above 75%, which is twice as much as the average in the country in general. And there is this also issue, which is an aging of that group of workers. So they are aging very quickly, and they do not have, because they're very formal, they are not going to have access to a social security system. So they're not going to be cared for. They care their whole lives, which is a very taxing kind of work, and they don't have anyone to care for them when they age. So this is something that is very, I don't know, very illustrative of the political economy problem of care in Brazil, I would say. And this is something that the care policy needs to address in some way. So this is something that I think is important in understanding what a successful care policy would be. The other issue, I'm bringing here just some issues that we don't necessarily think about clearly. I'm not going to go through every single detail of that. The other thing I think that's very difficult when it comes to care policy is that, again, if you think what a care policy is trying to do, thinking of the diamond again, it's trying to take out of the family and put on the state. But there is always some that is going to be on the family. It's not like we're not going to care. We're still going to clean our houses. We're going to cook every now and then. We have all of these things that are still going to happen within the house. And within the house, those are relying on women so much more than on men in so many ways. And like there is, I mean, the gender impacts of that are like, there's so many layers to that. The type of work that women are doing versus the men, the time that they're putting on and so on, what that means for their insertion on the labor market. One thing that care policies are not that great at doing is entering the household. And this is something that I don't have a solution for that. Like you can't really go inside interfering that private space, and the way that works is very difficult. So you might as well end up being able to release care responsibilities of a family. So let's say a woman is spending 30 hours a week on care and the man is spending 10. And then comes the government, creates this great policy that releases 10 hours out of those couple. And then now the man is only putting 2 hours and the women just decrease like 3 hours or something like that. So it doesn't really resolve the problem if that doesn't actually, change as well the inside the house, the intra-household dynamics. And I think, I mean, a successful care policy in the medium long term can achieve that, but this is something that is a little harder to achieve because it has to do with the ways of changing the way we think about care, which also I think relates to this idea of how we are paying care workers as well. Like the fact that they are very low paid workers is also an expression of how little value we give to care. And that then has all of those implications in the labor market, in the global care chains, and so on. I don't know if I should say something on commodification. Maybe I'll come back to that if the word comes back to me, because I think I already spoke too much.
No, that's fantastic, and thank you for the what you said about sort of access to or who performs care work, both its paid and its unpaid iterations, because that was going to be my next question. Because in both of your remarks, you spoke about social reproduction processes and care intersecting with inequalities, whether based on gender, race, ethnicity, that came up in both your remarks. And I think in the remarks, it was coming more from a place of who can access care. But Luiza, now you have now also sort of broadened that to who performs care in, you know, all of its iterations, and I think that's important to also kind of highlight. So I'm glad that you did that. But we're also actually, I mean, at a good time to take any questions from audience, if that works for the two of you.